Greetings and welcome to the Progressive Christians podcast. We are the love your neighbor kind of Christians and not the storm the Capitol kind. So if you are curious about what a socially and politically progressive Christianity looks like, then this is a podcast for you. My name is Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter. I am your host, and I'm also the lead pastor of the Loft Faith Community in Westwood, California. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about Hurricane Helene and the political response to that hurricane, and the role progressive theology might play in thinking theologically about not only natural disasters, but how we think about ecology. What does it mean to think about environmental justice and environmentalism from a religious perspective, and how might that inform the politics that we actually have around these issues? In today's episode, I am joined by the entire crew. We're all here for at least a little bit. Wesley, Blair, and Julia. How are y'all doing?
Hello.
Hello, doing good.
We're all here. We're all making it,
We're on a
surviving.
streak, all of us.
I know.
Here, look at us.
I know. I think it's gonna might be broken next week because I'm gonna be traveling, but we'll figure it out. We try.
We do our best.
We do our best. We do our best. I wanted to begin the conversation by talking about what's been happening, what happened with this hurricane. First and foremost, we hope everybody that's there has been able to that's been impacted by this. I mean, I know it's like 260 people is what they say have died thus far. So the death toll is continuing to rise. There's still people without power, access to clean water. There's still people really trying to survive, in the midst of the infrastructure consequences, I should say. And so we just are hopeful that people are finding ways to take care of themselves and that the communities are stepping up and we're, to help them figure out how to survive these next few weeks before they can figure out what they're going to do next with their lives. I have a couple of friends who live in Asheville and they just left. Like, they were fortunate that they left before things got bad, and they're staying in Texas and things like that. So it's been wild, actually. So
And
anyway.
there's Milton. There's like another one.
Literally hitting this morning, right? As we're recording.
And I think I saw that there's another one that's forming right now. So there might be a triple.
Goodness.
That's
a lot.
Head to desk if you can, because there's no visual on the podcast. I just slammed my head into the desk.
Yeah.
Because, my Lord, we are not ready. We are not ready for the way the way the earth has changed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And this is a different kind of conversation that we necessarily wanted to have. So maybe we can save it for later. But a part of an appropriate response to what's happening is a change in infrastructure. And this is where I think we consistently fall short and struggle in terms of how we're going to respond to what's happening. And you see other countries, in my mind, I'm thinking particularly the Netherlands, just doing such a better job of preparing for what we're doing to our planet. And what we find is that people who are living in these coastal communities, especially when you're talking about the South and Southeast, this is where you get frustrated, where I know we talk about how people vote against their interests with respect to issues of like, bodily autonomy and healthcare. But this is another thing where it's like, if you live in a state that wants to divest from infrastructure and then privatize everything, the consequences when something like this happens, you don't have the built-in capacity to respond. Like, you haven't invested in the things that you need as a society to survive. And it's sad. I see it. I'm just like, this is frustrating that people aren't able to tie this together.
Well, and Asheville's not even coastal, right? Like, it's Western North Carolina. It's in the mountains, right? So that's the thing that I think folks didn't realize as we were trying to give warnings about how climate change was going to affect everybody, not just the coastal cities. And yeah, everybody thinks it's not their problem until suddenly it's on your doorstep.
Well, and I think if you buy into that idea that, like, I am an island, I'm my own responsibility, it's just me, my wife, my 2 kids, and our dog, and nothing. Like, if you really and genuinely and sincerely spend your entire life believing that, and then you learn that it's not true in like the worst way imaginable, like, it just makes me sad.
Well, and yeah, because you learn very quickly when suddenly there are no roads that, oh, shoot, you can't build all the roads. Like, you do need other people. We are caught up in each other's lives, whether we want to or not. And Yeah.
But, like, it's, like,
I
too
think
late.
nothing breaks rugged individualism like natural disaster.
Ooh.
As people say, quote unquote, the power of God, an act of God. Now, God's participation in environmental degradation and climate change, that's a whole other theological can of worms.
Yes, yeah.
But these things that are so much bigger and more powerful than we can understand or comprehend, it really does just like it breaks worldviews.
I want to share a little bit about at least the touch on the political before we start getting into the theological. Some of the lies, and I think this is what makes it worse, right? In terms of how people get wrapped up in politicizing natural disasters that ends up harming people's capacity to respond, ultimately, like our capacity to respond. And so, like, some of the lies, like, Trump, again, Republicans are claiming, particularly Trump, is like, oh, Biden hasn't answered calls from Georgia's governor, right? Like, and saying things like, oh, he's calling Brian Kemp and he's not able to get a hold of him. And then, Brian Kemp comes back and says, actually, no, I actually we've talked and he said whatever you need, we're gonna make sure we have it for you. He talks about how there's this anti-Republican bias in the North Carolina response. How, oh, they're not responding quickly to what's happening in North Carolina because it's a predominantly conservative state, Republican state. Even though he has no evidence of this, it's just what he can say.
But his evidence is
And
that's how he behaved in the
exactly,
past,
yeah,
which we
Correct.
yeah,
learned
to
One of the
California,
most
right?
terrifying
to
lies I've
California.
seen is that FEMA is somehow like any kind of federal response
Yeah.
is like out to get you. So there was like a meme going around, or like a on Twitter, I've seen X, pardon me, I've seen people like talking about like the number of FEMA folks that they've like caught or got, or like that there's target practice trying to catch federal responders, like that somehow the people that our tax dollars have hired and trained to respond for exactly this moment are somehow the enemy in this setting, and that lie is being perpetrated, and that FEMA's like coming to take your land, when in reality they're like coming to make sure you're not dead.
Yeah. So one of the lies he said on Thursday at a rally, he said in Michigan, Trump claimed that Kamala spent all her FEMA money, billions of dollars, on housing for illegal immigrants, many of whom should not be in our country. It says he added in an election-related conspiracy theory, saying they stole the FEMA money just like they stole it from the bank, so they could give it to their illegal immigrants that they want to vote for them this season. Again, this is false. There's like no evidence.
Layers of lies.
It's
It's
like,
Layers of
so
lies.
bad. It's so bad. It's very bad.
but then it's like this is
Ooh.
what leads to people being like in danger for their lives, right?
Yeah.
Like how people are like,
Yes.
Yeah.
oh, like that's the consequence of this. People believe it. They're like, oh, whatever this man says must be true because the people who are saying that he's lying hate him. So
Yep.
therefore it must be true, right? It's a
Mhm.
self-fulfilling prophecy. Even though as we see, as the data says, Congress appropriated $35 billion disaster relief funds for 2024, right? Like, and all that stuff gets meted out through Homeland Security and FEMA and everything else, and it's spent on disasters, not anything to do with immigrants. Like so, it's
Well, but
insane.
also that Mike Johnson won't call Congress back to vote on additional funding for it. Like,
That's just sad.
And it's so
he's
difficult to articulate to rural voters or Republican voters that,
who
like,
don't
the people
understand
who
how
you
it works.
continue to elect continue to make it difficult for the federal government to respond to these natural disasters. And now your town is flooded. It feels like you don't have what you need as a result.
Right. I mean, they don't have what they need, and I think there's also
There's no way to correct the story because they're not listening,
Well, this is
or
also the
even
argument
yeah.
that like
so bad.
um, that we're going
Baffling.
to take care of our own, that we don't need the federal government because we're going to take care of our own. It
Right.
reminds me of this joke that a man was in a flood and he was praying to God to send someone to save him. And a neighbor came by and knocked on the door and said, "It's time to evacuate. Do you want to ride out with us?" And he says, "No, God will save me." And then the floodwaters come and a neighbor rows by on a boat and says, "Hey, friend, do you want to go? like it's time to go, and he says, no, God will save me. And then he's on the roof, and then the Coast Guard drops down with a helicopter, and they're like, hey man, it's time to go, are you ready to go? And he's like, no, God's gonna save me. And then he doesn't, and he dies, and he gets to heaven. He's like, God, why didn't you save me? And he's like, my dude, I sent you a police officer to tell you evacuate, I sent you a neighbor in a boat, and I sent you the Coast Guard with a helicopter. What more do you want?
Yeah.
Right? Like this idea that somehow like God has some special relationship with you that's going to make you invincible, instead of recognizing that God's relationship with you is through other people, and that's who he's sending. That's why who God is sending. Like, we are entwined with one another.
Yeah. It makes me think of like the very cold winter, or a couple, whatever, the blizzard thing that Texas had that made their electrical grid fail.
The
And
one
that's
where they had
because,
crews left?
and people froze, like,
Yeah,
because
people
they
died.
refuse to be connected
to the rest of the grid to the rest of the country. Texas chooses to be independent that way, and then you see the fallout from that. But it hasn't changed, and we'll see in this election if Texans choose to move in a different direction. But
They won't.
I'm not holding out for hope.
It's
Yeah.
We're all just baffled by it. It's just so like, oh my God.
All right.
What is the theological response? What should we be thinking theologically?
Let's move to talking about it theologically. And Blair, I know we had discussed, we want to talk a little bit about the emergence of the environmental justice movement and how this kind of ties into not only what's happening in North Carolina, but the broader tension sometimes that exists between environmentalism and environmental justice. And the through line through much of what's happening in these spaces is you can have a lot of conservative Christians who would call themselves environmentalists, but definitely not environmental justice advocates. And it's this justice piece that often becomes the wedge issue, if you will. So yeah, Blair, I know you want to say a little bit about kind of the origins and distinctions and stuff like that.
Yeah. So in the 1970s, there were kind of two events that happened. There was a major environmental disaster in Love Canal, which is near Niagara Falls, New York. And that was a predominantly white community. And the way in which the toxic waste seeped into the community, it made the land uninhabitable. We have heard this story so many times. It's why the EPA exists, right? It makes the land uninhabitable. It makes the water undrinkable. It's giving people cancer. And there became evidence of this. And the people of Love Canal fought until essentially the government bought their land from them so that they could leave and start a new life somewhere else, because they couldn't sell their land that was toxic to like other people. That would be massively, no one would buy it. And so they fought and fought and fought until the US government responded and paid them for their land. Now, in the similar era, something similar happened in Warren County. Is that Ohio? I don't remember where Warren County is, but Warren County, Warren County, North Carolina. North Carolina. So right in the same zone that we're talking about with Helene. Warren County was a predominantly Black community where toxic waste was being shipped into that community in order to dispose of it. And surprise, surprise, the same thing happened. It leached into the land, leached into the water, and it was no longer safe to live there. And the government would not respond the same way. And so actually, this is an area that the church got involved in Warren County, and historically the United Church of Christ got deeply, deeply involved in Warren County, and essentially started the first environmental justice and race conversation, and advocated on behalf of Warren County, and was able to get movement in Congress to essentially provide them the same response as Love Canal. But these two stories juxtaposed next to each other are often used to start to show that environmental justice is deeply tied to race and racism, and that communities of color are much more likely to be exposed to toxic chemicals and also receive less response when an environmental disaster occurs. And so a lot of people don't know that the church has been so deeply involved in environmental justice in the United States since the very, very beginning of some of these conversations, and that the church has participated really well at times in recognizing that this is an intersectional and multi-layer issue. So those are two stories that have really helped me learn more about environmental justice and the theology of it and how it's related to race and racism. And so we'll have some articles in the show notes, but I'm seeing, similar questions happening here with Helene versus Katrina. I was a kid when Katrina happened, but I remember sort of hearing vaguely that it had occurred. But in my white wealthy community, like, we did not really respond to Katrina until months and months later, and sort of like some quote unquote token Katrina refugees were showing up and enrolling in our high school. And then all of a sudden there was this outpouring. Whereas Helene, like, people are jumping in, right? Because, well, my church used to send us to Asheville, North Carolina to go on mission trips and go to Appalachia and help build houses. And like, that's a community that like we know, and it's full of white people that look like us. And so they're responding a lot more quickly.
I mean,
So even in that response, I'm seeing, these layers of racism. And
believe it or
yeah,
not, I was optimistic. I thought we had just learned from Katrina. I was like, "Oh, we're doing better." No.
maybe I hope that's a bit of it too.
I would say I do think so because there has been so much criticism for the lack of response from Hurricane Katrina. It really, I think, spoke to the way in which a lot of people in Louisiana felt. Now, I should also be really clear. My dad's side of the family is from Louisiana. My brother was displaced because of the hurricane. We had lots of people staying with us during this time, and so I was really aware of what was going on. And the response, in part similar to what we saw in the beginnings of the environmental justice movement in Warren County, was New Orleans. The parts that were mostly harmed were predominantly Black. In Warren County, the population was 62% Black, right? And so and it was, if I'm not mistaken, the county had the highest percentage of Black residents in North Carolina at the time. And so what we found is this pattern of a lack of response due to race. And I think where the church deserves credit is that in both these instances, whether it is Katrina or the beginning of the environmental justice movement, broadly speaking, a lot of church denominations really stepped up and actually did a lot. UCC is a predominantly white denomination. Now, these are Black clergy, but they got a lot of support from, people. And I think that shows something in terms of how people want to recognize the common humanity in all these other folks. For me, though, I think what I am hoping we could begin to think about in terms of this disaster is how people can have a theology or kind of this theological framework that allows for them to not take the environment or environmental justice seriously or to think theologically about it, right? How they not connect how they vote for certain candidates to their practice of faith and how their practice of faith actually should influence how they think about the environment. So one of the things we'll probably put in the show notes is one chapter that I wrote in this book, the Bloomsbury Handbook on Religion and Ecology. It's entitled Blood in the Soil, the racial, racist, and religious dimensions of environmentalism. And so in this chapter, I kind of give an overview of or how religion organizations as such or Christianity has been kind of complicit in creating the culture where these disasters can be, I don't say not taken seriously, but seen as an inevitable consequence rather than actually something we ought to necessarily do something about in terms of our response. And the primary problem I get to while I tell a lot of the stories around the creation narratives and how that has um, our idea of what it means to be an environmentalist is often framed through the lens of caring for like the planet for the sake of leisure, for hiking, for camping, for fishing, for whatever. It doesn't take seriously necessarily people's capacity to live in the land and on the land, and for those working on the land, because those are predominantly jobs that have been done by Black and Latinx folks, right?
Yep.
And so this is why we tend to not necessarily think theologically about those. And so what I get at ultimately is what we need is to develop a theology, and what I try to articulate at the end of the chapter is a theology that recognizes, as we've talked about multiple times on this podcast, our common humanity. What does it mean to recognize that we are deeply interdependent with non-human nature? Right? Like we are not in dominion in this way of being above nature where we can live outside of it. Rather, what we allow happening to our planet obviously impacts us every day.
Mm-hmm.
And the failure of theological imagination to actually understand that relationship and to really take that seriously in terms of how we live and the theologies we articulate, how it's become politicized is just so flawed that it allows, I would argue, situations like what's happening in North Carolina to happen because they make theological arguments about not investing in anything that's going to help or help them do any disaster preparation or anything to do with ecology because they're like, well, it's about helping people rather than actually about caring for our planet. And they don't see these things as interconnected. That's what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, because I've even in the progressive church grown up hearing progressive Christians say, well, environmental stuff, like, yeah, that's important, but it's not as important as feeding people right now. And that's such a short-sighted way of understanding creation that, like you said, it's about preserving nature for our pleasure instead of recognizing we have to we have to preserve the earth for our own survival.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that folks are taking a turn on that now. And in some ways, right, we know climate scientists are telling us it's almost too late. But that, like, caring for the earth is about caring for people. That they're not disconnected. Because like I said, I've heard people make the other argument of like, oh, that's nice, but we can't make that a priority because
Yeah.
it's not about people right now.
In that argument, I don't understand, like, to say we shouldn't be worried about the earth, we should be worried about feeding people. I'm confused as to where the food comes from.
Yeah, well, it was white people making this claim. Again, privileged Midwestern white people, right, who've never grown a thing or picked a thing a day in their lives. God bless them. Just like Dr. Carter was saying, like, they cannot connect the source of their food and the people who grow it. So one of the things I always pray, always, 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 when somebody asks me to give grace, is let us bless this food and those who prepared it, from those who put it in the ground to those who have harvested it and put it on trucks and drove it to us. Like, I always try to remind people that there's a whole cycle here of how food ends up on our plates. And it's amazing how many privileged white folks have just never thought about it.
Yeah.
And
Are they
certainly never thought about, like, the humanity of the people who are making it happen.
Of course not. Julia, we've talked about this where we're talking about sort of the extension of like supply lines and how distant we are from the food that we eat. And it makes it that much harder for people to acknowledge that like this isn't just magically showing up at a grocery store.
Yes, I understand that. What I'm struggling with is like the idea there's still something missing in it for me that I did not.
It's the same way that people can be so anti-immigrant. I mean, we were talking about this last week or 2 weeks ago, right? You can be so anti-immigrant and also be complaining about the higher cost of food in the grocery store
Yeah.
and not understand that those two things are deeply connected. If you don't have immigrant labor, you don't have fresh food. They are the same conversation.
We also need to like separate the fact that like food shouldn't be like a for-profit structure. Like this is feeding people.
That's a whole other conversation.
Now, I think one of the challenges that we're going to have in terms of how we have this, not so much how we have this conversation, but just recognizing the ways in which these things are interconnected is recognizing that for the most part, depending on your class privilege, and I would say this does definitely go along class lines almost as much as racial lines. You're not
Mm-hmm.
worried about where to get your food because you think you just can afford to get it from somewhere. You
Yeah.
know, you're like, it doesn't like, it comes from the ground, but you're like, well, I'll be okay. I'll just get it from this other place if I can't get it from there.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this belief that we will be an exception from the potential harm that will happen, that will befall of us because our not taking these things seriously. And so for me, the reason again, I get back to, I think this is a progressive theological issue is this is one of the reasons why, if you come to visit our church, you will find that, is a lot of vegetarian, vegan stuff happening because all this stuff is tied into climate change. And I'm like, if we're going to be
Mm-hmm.
morally consistent, we're not going to have barely any, anything to do with products that are not vegetarian or vegan. because I want to actually help I believe it's morally our moral obligation to preserve our planet and to take care of
Yeah.
other people. These things are interconnected, and at first, as y'all know, some people were resistant to it, but broadly speaking, everybody's just like, okay, this is what this guy's gonna
Yeah.
do, and that's okay. We got good falafel out here. We're able
Yeah.
to make it
Oh,
by.
delicious. Our
Mhm.
coffee creamers are oat milk and still fantastic. People still love them.
Exactly. And so, like, there's just other alternatives, other things we can do to as progressives to say, okay, we recognize there's this challenge. We recognize that we are living in the midst of environmental catastrophe. How should we change what it is we do, right, as communities
Mhm.
to live in alignment that can actually begin to address these needs? And I would say one of the easiest things to do is our diet, obviously, right? Is first and foremost one of the things we can do. And actually talk about how these things are interconnected. Talk about, I mean, Wesley, you are committed to taking public transportation in a way that I think is ultimately something that's for the common good in
Mhm.
terms of what does that mean? I have an electric vehicle and I also know that's very privileged and everybody can do that. But like it's trying to make the choices that we can and also vote in ways that hold institutions accountable. And I think this is what I get back to again when it comes
Yep.
to like 100 companies are responsible for roughly about 70% of the carbon emissions in the world.
It's wild.
And so, like, it literally is like if we had enough collective will to hold these 100 companies accountable, we actually really could address climate change. And yet, like, you don't hear people of faith critiquing the kind of capitalism
Mhm.
that is tied to this extractive nature. You know what I'm saying? Like
Yep.
that's I guess what I'm trying to get at. Maybe we're getting at towards the end of the podcast. It's like to see how if you're a progressive Christian and you care about the environment, you have to then there start thinking about this is an intersectional issue.
Yeah.
And I think it's the only way we're gonna make any headway.
It's like the
I think that
most intersectional issue. It is
It
our
is.
habitat. It is what we eat. It's literally like it
Mm,
is it's
Mhm.
our plant. It's where it's our
Mhm.
food and our
Mhm.
air and our water. It's the
Mhm.
most intersectional issue. And the fact that capitalism has been able to keep us so separate this long to the point of almost essentially really no return, right? Like, and we're still plowing ahead. Baby, she's keeping on, she's pushing on, right? Like no changes, no even attempt to address the issue in the least intrusive way. Like no nothing. We're not even trying.
I mean, I think the hard part is that, like, when I tell people that, yeah, I 2 years ago I got rid of my car and I take public transit everywhere. Sure, my life is different. I have had to, like, when I chose to move, I chose a place that could be walkable, that had gave me access to public transit. So I had to change my life in order to move in this direction. And I think that hardship, I think, is oftentimes too much for people to even consider. And it with public transit, that's probably a bigger ask, but like eating less meat or choosing not to eat meat, that feels like it should be easier, but it does demand something that a lot of people are just not willing to give up, the comforts of the world that they've built.
Well, but I also think that our society tells us like you're supposed to eat meat and that like these things that aren't also like people aren't even willing to unpack kind of the like Western ideas in their culture in their day-to-day lives. Like why do you think you're supposed to eat meat with every meal? Why do you think that? That like that's a very specific conditioning that isn't necessarily in line with our species, but if you read a little bit, like, you might learn that where those ideas come from, and then maybe it's easier to question, but people just don't generally even question it. Like, yeah, every meal you have a meat and a starch and a vegetable, and otherwise it's not a real meal. Like, what? Why do you
yeah,
even think that?
and I think even deeper than that, and I want to get back to the point you just made, Wesley, because I think it's really important. Julia, when you pointed out like why do we think we need to eat 3 times a day and where does that come from?
Mm,
Now, as
mm.
someone who's done and taught a class in food studies, I was like, oh wow, how have I not thought of this? and realizing, oh, you should just eat when you're hungry makes perfect sense, But that's the way in which Victorian norms and capitalism can converge to create a particular kind of pattern that we believe to be true. And Wesley, I think the point you made about people's unwillingness to like the issue, as you said, is, are we willing to sacrifice? May not be the right word, but what did you say? Like,
I don't know what I said. My
yeah,
brain
but
was going.
It was
ultimately, like,
brilliant. It was
just to,
profound.
well, it's like, are you willing to make the choice to give up something, right? And I
Mm,
think
mhm,
that's the thing is like we, even as progressives, like that's like
mhm.
you can always be like, oh, I'm all for decolonization, I'm all for, anti-capitalism. Like, okay, are you willing then to just we got to give some stuff back? You got to
Yeah.
give some land back to some indigenous folks. We got to give some money back to, people of color for reparations. That's going to cost you something. And I think we don't often want to pay the cost of discipleship,
Mm.
right? Like even progressives, we
Mhm,
resistant
mhm,
because we've become comfortable, especially in
mhm.
America, with all the privileges that we have. And there is a cost to undo the harm
Yep.
that we have done in the collective we as Americans. And yet, when I believe if we were willing to pay that cost and to create what King would call the beloved community, or do something that moves us toward the common good, perhaps it would decrease the extreme wealth, but it would raise the floor such that like
Mhm,
our lives would collectively be better,
mhm.
right?
It wouldn't act it's not actually a cost.
Yeah, in the grand scheme, it isn't a cost, but it is an emotional, intellectual
Right.
giving up something that you think is yours, right? And
Yep.
so this is where I think again, the language of sin is very helpful for
Mm,
me.
mhm.
Mhm.
I should say I define sin, since I'm the pastor of this community, as a failure to love. And so it's like this is where it's like this is a loving act, and failing to love in this sense becomes very selfish. So I feel like, this is a way for us to get at, as Julia said, the most intersectional issue. And I want to say one thing before we transition to talk about, I think, a more interesting conversation about kind of wrap up at our pop culture / politics moment. But the reason we were having this conversation today is I think we had mentioned last week I was going to be going to run a half marathon in
Mhm.
Atlanta.
Were
And
you?
now,
Were you? Because
yeah,
I told you when you told me, I said, "You
I
ain't
know.
going to Atlanta. You ain't."
I know. I was super excited to go, and this whole race was about it's called the race. It's in Atlanta. You can do a 5K or a half marathon, and it's about celebrating Black run culture. It's really
Mm.
about the empowerment that we can have collectively exercising together. If you think about what's happening in Atlanta and the ways in which Ahmaud Arbery is like just running in Atlanta and gets murdered, right? Like it's really to reclaim the capacity of us to just be human and exercise. And I decided not to go because there was a chemical plant explosion about 20 miles southwest of Atlanta, and it was a pool chemical plant. And so there is this chlorine fog that would kind of sweep over the region every evening. And the EPA, the Georgia EPA, everybody else was trying to say, "Oh, it's fine. It's mostly a problem at night." Um,
Just stay
but
inside.
yeah,
Close the windows.
and so like there wasn't a lot of information about this, in part because I would argue who is going to be predominantly impacting. It was impacting poor people and people of color. And so the infrastructure for the Georgia EPA is not one that actually is going to be truthful, right? They're much more concerned about obscuring the truth.
I think that that's irrespective of here's where I think the intersectionality really comes in is capitalism is going to keep whizzing whether you are white. They are not going to say everyone in the greater Atlanta region, black or white, you need to get out because you can't breathe the air. They're not going to say that. They're not going to do that. They're not going to grind everything to we had a whole pandemic.
Absolutely.
People were like,
Mhm.
but the economy,
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
like they're this is the greed.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Call it a chlorine is a greed. A hurricane, it's greed. It's greed.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah. And to be clear, the race was still scheduled and people still ran and people had the choice to go run, and I'm sure some people had a great time and really enjoyed the community aspect of it. I chose not to because of my own health conditions, and I felt like it was just too much of a risk for me. This is the kind of slow violence is the language we use in religion and ecology, where it's like we all, as you said, we breathe the same air, and like we all are victims to it, but it's happening over a long period of time. So it's a kind of violence, or it's elongated, that you won't know the consequences to what's happening to your body probably for maybe a little while. And
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
yeah, maybe nothing happens, but maybe something happens. And I would feel terribly guilty if I end up having some kind of lung problem because I chose to do something that I have enough education to know better than doing. And so it's, I made that choice.
Well,
And I think that, again, the frustrating part, as you said, Julia, is that the system is set up to put us in positions to have to make this choice rather than actually even holding corporations accountable. This is the second time that
Yep.
same plant exploded. This is the second time in, like, I think 10 years or something like that. I was like,
well, and people don't talk about the Trump administration and the rolling back of
the VP.
regulations
Yeah, yeah,
for, like, people have not, there have been so many recalls on food, listeria, but like all of these
Oh my God. Yeah.
illnesses that have happened, chemical plant explosions, entire communities being destroyed because of the lack of regulation these companies and corporations are able to enjoy. The freedom of destroying the air that we breathe and the water that we drink for greed. And a thing that people don't think about is if Donald Trump wins again, there will be no EPA. It will cease to
oh, yeah,
exist.
yeah. I mean, this is Project 2025, and we're gonna have an episode on that before the election because we need to actually just unpack it for people who don't want to. I think it's our obligation to be like, hey, this is, or actually, don't have the time. You know, people here got jobs and stuff like that.
Mhm.
It's my job. I've
Yeah.
already read some of it. I read enough of it and then just bullet point how terrible it is. Although I think if you listen to this podcast, you're probably not voting for Donald Trump anyway. But it's good to
I hope
know.
not.
Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe if you're thinking about voting for Donald Trump, you listen to this podcast, we've convinced you not to,
Yeah.
which would
Send
be
me an
great.
email. I'd be happy to have a conversation with you, but please don't. Please don't vote for Donald Trump.
Don't email me.
I don't
Me.
think
I'm
so
signing
yet.
up for this.
I would say don't email Julia too, actually. But Julia, I know we were talking before about a podcast that Vice President Kamala Harris was on.
Yeah.
Part of her
She's
campaign
making
strategy has been to get into engaging influencers.
non-traditional media.
Yeah. So say a little bit more about this podcast and what happened.
She was on Call
Her
Her
daddy.
Daddy. I'd not heard of this. I am not the target demographic, it turns out. But I listened to the interview and it was a great interview. She said, oh God, put it on my tombstone. The Alex is the name of the podcast host, and she asked her about what Sarah Huckabee Sanders said a few
Yep.
weeks ago about Sarah Huckabee Sanders said, I have children and they keep me humble. I might be the governor of where is she the governor of Alabama, Arkansas?
Arkansas.
Arkansas. I'm the governor of Arkansas, but when I go home at night, I still have to change diapers and having kids keeps me humble. Who's keeping Kamala Harris humble? She doesn't have any kids. No one keeps her humble. And Kamala Harris said, what she doesn't realize is that there are a whole lot of women out here who are not aspiring to be humble.
Mm-hmm.
Inject it into my veins, write it on my tombstone. I don't know that anything has ever resonated so deeply with me personally, but that's again not the target demographic of that podcast. So it appears in the comments of said podcast, the target demographic is not as warm and receptive to those ideas as I personally would like, but we'll see what happens in 30 days. What's the date? Oh God.
Less than a month. It's wild because so much, or at least in the reading that I've done about call her daddy, is that so much of the topic has to do, or even the message that Alex Cooper, the host, put out before, it was like so many of the topics on her podcast deal with women's autonomy, their ability to like make decisions for themselves. And so this conversation with Kamala is perfect. Like we're going into an election where on the ballot is women's autonomy. And so for her viewership, that's not listenership, to have been part of these conversations for this long, and then to engage with a political candidate on these very topics, and for them to be like, I'm never listening to this again, is so wild to me, because you've been a part of this conversation about how it's important that you have bodily autonomy, that you be able to make decisions for yourself, and yet when it's put to you in front of you that is a political candidate who can continue to support that, you're not in favor.
I mean,
Yeah, I think that I mean, I remember in the NFL when all the players were taking a knee and people are like, "Oh, we're gonna stop watching the blah blah blah." NFL making money hand over fist, right? So like
Yep.
a lot of people say they're gonna stop doing something that they keep, or then when they boycotting Budweiser for a little bit. I mean, like people say
But
stuff. They say
I
stuff.
sure, but come November, it is going to be hard pressed for Kamala Harris to win an election without the support of white women.
100%.
Hmm.
And
I
I'm not
think.
going to, it's very disheartening for me to see that response. They just hate her.
Well, I
And
think, Julia, this is where I think like one of the benefits I think of stepping back and not being on social media and all this other stuff as much as you realize that it's a small percentage of actual people, first of all.
Sure.
But second of all, even her followers who are willing to make the comment, it may not be a strong enough sample size of her actual followers, right? It's the people who are so
Fair.
upset that they want to
Yeah.
make a comment, right?
so
And
Absolutely.
so
you think she's going to win white women in November?
We don't
no,
know. That we're
I
none
have
of us
no
are making
idea.
predictions.
Yeah, that wasn't what I was saying.
Okay,
What
great.
I
Just
no, 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 no. But what I'm saying, and she's not gonna win the majority of white women. She has to take enough of white women away from Trump.
Yep.
That's all that is. You have to take enough. It's all about the margins because of our electoral college. This is all about the margins. I mean, would she
Hmm.
win a popular vote? Yeah, she's probably going to win like 54% of the vote, and that's like at the edge of what she needs to do to win the election, right? Unfortunately, that's our system, you know.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so, what we have seen is that when reproductive autonomy has been on the ballot, these conservative women have voted for reproductive autonomy in Ohio and all these other states,
Hmm.
right? They still vote for that. And so there is hope, right? That they will actually vote for that come this November because that's what the election is also about too, right? They've showed us right now in their actions that they're willing to do it, right? Now, can they do it when it's embodied in a black woman? I don't know.
Or when
I
it's
don't know.
embodied by a Democrat.
Yeah, I don't
Well,
know.
I also think, Arizona, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Florida, these are all states where it is directly on the ballot.
Hmm.
I have developed fears that these are the women that will vote in favor of abortion in their state and and because they can vote in favor of
Hmm.
abortion in their state, they then will feel good voting the opposite at the top of the ticket
Mm.
in
I
the
mean, we'll
swing
Yeah.
find
state.
out.
We'll find out because I mean, essentially, what they're saying, and this is the benefit of making an argument around Project 2025, is talking about the ways in which, even if you have state autonomy, there's a way in which you can create federal oversight of all this stuff and create a national restriction on abortion that's at like 12 weeks or whatever,
Hmm.
which would trump,
Which is
with
essentially,
no
yeah,
pun
I mean,
intended,
it's a
right?
ban.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Is it
and so
12
this
weeks? I thought it was earlier.
and so I think they're talking about 12, but the hope is that they would be consistent, but we don't know. And I think that is, it's the same thing with evangelicals, it's all this
Hmm.
stuff. I mean,
Hmm.
it's all on
Hmm.
the margins right now. So again, I've never heard of this podcast. I saw
Me
this
neither.
interview. I was like, oh,
I've
okay,
never heard of it.
this is interesting. But I mean, hey, there gotta be a podcast for everybody, That's what I'm saying. You gotta
Absolutely.
For
Everyone
have
has
your own
ears for the most
for
part.
me,
exactly.
there's a difference between winning. Winning is I'm not saying winning obviously matters. Winning matters most. There is still something very disheartening about just the state of it
Oh,
all.
fully. And it's going to take decades to get to a better place.
Are we do we have decades?
We don't have a choice.
I
We have to keep
mean,
living.
You talking about as a species?
yes, I'm
As
talking
a
about as a
I was talking
planet.
about as a society. But
Sure,
yeah, also as a
also.
species.
Do we have decades? I don't know. I'm not convinced that we
I
have
think
decades.
we have decades. I think
That's
no,
optimistic.
we're not. No, that's pretty scientific, actually. I think what's going to happen is people are going to suffer. Some people don't
Hmm.
have decades. I
Hmm.
think this is what we're seeing this
Hmm.
right now. Now, again, we can't get in. This is another 40 minutes of conversation, so
Absolutely
we're going to
is.
wrap it up. But there is parts of our planet that are going to be suffering in the next. That's suffering now.
Yeah.
Because of the environmental. To take this full circle, because of environmental justice,
Yep.
right? There are islands that are no longer existing,
Right.
because of global climate change. So yeah, no, it is. We have passed the tipping point, and now it's more about how can we reduce the harm. And it is very possible, but it's going to require a kind of moral effort that people have to be willing to
An
take.
organized effort.
An organized effort. So we'll see.
Yeah, no
Yeah.
problem.
Yeah.
Easy peasy lemon squeezy.
Exactly. On that actual optimistic note of hope, I know it's probably not, but we try to be the optimism for Julie when we need to be. We try to be Wesley and I. I want to thank you all for joining us for the Progressive Christians podcast. If you would like to connect with us to be part of the conversation, you can find us on Instagram at the Progressive Christians with underscores in between, and on TikTok at the Progressive Christians with periods in between. We are getting actually a lot of conversation on TikTok. I don't know. I've kind of figured out how to. I'm managing the
I
social
see you in there
media.
commentating.
You're
Yeah.
so
I'm like,
I
ooh,
know.
good for
I'm
him.
like, we're getting building a little TikTok community. So
Good.
it's interesting actually. But yeah. So if you want to be a part of that, there's definitely a lot of people still talking about some of our previous episodes and stuff in there, which is pretty cool. So we invite you to join us on there. Again, if you like the show, please rate, review, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. We really want to be a safe place and a refuge for people who are trying to find a Christianity that speaks to them, that is about love and justice, and that allows them to be themselves, but also recognize the full humanity in others. So we really hope you are enjoying what we're doing, and you continue to support the content that we're creating. Thanks for listening, and we will see you all next time. Bye.
Bye.